What's going on, everybody? This is Nick Gomez Cologne,
Nikos Myrogiannis Koukos.
and welcome to episode 5 of Out of This World, a podcast on Gustav Holst, The Planets. We are super excited to be back. We are talking about Saturn, the bringer of old age, today.
And who best to talk about old age like a doctoral student who's been around for so long and feels old in here. But no, I'm not going to talk about me. I'm going to talk about, and we're going to talk about this very, very beautiful, out of this world movement of the piece. It's episode 5 already. Oh my god, time is flying, right?
It is. It absolutely is. So, to give you our usual rundown that we give at the beginning of each of these episodes, we are looking at this piece and doing a deep analysis to find some of the more narrative, textual, and deeper meanings of the work apart from everything that's happening musically. Nikos and I are a conductor and a composer. We're both students at James Madison University, and we're doing a deep analysis of this piece. And while on the topic of analysis, as always, the disclaimer I'm going to give is we just finished listening to the particular movement, and the score and recording that we're going to be referring to and that we have in our minds are both available in the description below. So if you want to go ahead and follow along with us, or you want to refer to our notes and our thoughts later on, you have the ability to do so in the description. So this is a very interesting movement right off the bat, especially if you've heard the work before or you're listening to the work chronologically. This is very out there in comparison. And that kind of leads into the main topic I want to talk about. So this episode is going to be a little bit different because Nikos and I both have one topic each that we want to really dive into because this movement is so different from the rest. And my topic I want to talk about is the idea of alienation. So we've been mentioning brief examples of this in the previous 4 movements, little musical things or little painting things that are alienated in comparison to everything else that's happening musically. But this movement is full of that. So I'm going to be talking about that. Nikos, do you want to go ahead and introduce your little topic you want to talk about?
I'm going to be talking about narrativity. So he's talking about the old age, and if you remember, if you've seen listen to episode 4, it was about the jollity, probably young age, almost certainly. So this is kind of a response, or there's like the circle of life coming full circle now with this 5th movement, and up to this point in the planets, Saturn is astrologically associated with that kind of feeling of maturity in general. So I will be talking about the small elements and the big ideas that create a very specific linear, chronologically speaking, narrative.
Absolutely. So what we're going to do first is we're just going to kind of go through some of our notes and some things that we listened to in our individual analyses, and then we'll go into some of those bigger topics. So let's jump right into some of the things that are happening in this crazy little movement. So overall, I feel like this piece just has a lot of tension. There's a lot of anticipation leading to something bigger here, which obviously makes sense. If we're going off the idea of maturity and the idea of growth, it's really symbolic of life. Life is going to throw surprises at you. Life is going to throw unexpected events at you. And I feel like this movement really encompasses that. And right off the gate, we're presented with something that throws us off the moment we hear it, which is the opening chord. So we have this recurring chord of just this major 6 built on top or built below a tritone, and then it just moves down by 1 to the exact same thing, and it's just this back and forth kind of swaying feel. So right already we're presented with a very abstract sound, which is in stark contrast to the major C major chord that we heard at the end of the previous movement. So right away we're presented with this new sense of maturity and this new sense of solitude.
So exactly as you said, there is this beautiful BF chord. So these 2 notes sound together. So essentially the move starts with a tritone. That is setting up the pace and the whole affect for the movement and for old age. So old age probably affiliated with something ominous, something that's not right, something that's not it doesn't have the intimacy of a major triad or like a tonic kind of sound. And when the first melody of the piece starts is in the double bass, so a very, very low register, and it lays out those first two notes. So it starts with an F and goes to the B natural, and then has a half step, and then goes back, and then starts like that. So that's something that the composer wanted us to hear, like the first tritone, and it's really laid out above a carpet, like a harmonic carpet, which is very much metrically displayed. So there is a big, huge ostinato that is like syncopated, and it's very slow. So you don't have a very specific concept of time. And as Nick said, it's kind of vague in many ways.
Right. And something that I really want to talk about with this discussion before we get into our deeper topics is this is the first movement in the work so far that does not have a clear tonal center. Like every other movement up to this point has some type of like recognizable key that we start and end in. Now, of course, like depending on like, where the chords grow harmonically, this could change throughout the work. But here we're presented with no key signature, and we're presented with all these accidentals and these carefully used chords that Holst had obviously planned very carefully for like the delivery of what he's trying to convey. And I found that really interesting because, when comparing it to the other movements, we have that sense of that sense of an alienated like feeling in the harmonics. And if you scroll through like the pages of the score, it's just all these accidentals and these like chords that you might be able to recognize, but they don't really attach to any type of tonal center, which is interesting that he introduces such a technique, 5 movements into the whole work.
So at the same time, if we can talk about a specific narrative, which title is old age, it's maturity, it's wisdom, it's like life coming to an end a little by little, I would say that this tritone and this ostinato and this very low register and this tritone, I said about the tritone, yeah, it's like it's something that's very slow moving. So by virtue of size and velocity, this is kind of giving us the idea that we're not dealing with something that's swift, that's moving through time, mainly because, as we both said before, there is no clear concept of time. And as Nick said, and I want to emphasize on that, sometimes tonality impacts how we view time. It's not about only the tempo and the meter. Sometimes, like a C major is kind of a key that is easy to comprehend, and when things are moving, you as an audience member, you're able to move with them. There is no key signature, as Nick said. So even if you have the score in front of you, you still don't know what's really happening. Now, I want to move to kind of the second part of this piece, which is very, very fruitful to talk about both narrativity and the otherworldly elements. And suddenly the ostinato is there, but there's a different ostinato. Like the idea of having an ostinato is there. On my score is like the 1. It has number 1. It's boom, 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 and that kind same of idea. That's the same melody which was presented by the double bass now exists in the brass, and we start to build upon that. So what's your idea on terms of otherworldly elements in that second part of the piece?
Yeah, so this actually vaguely connects to a point I was going to make later on, which in the middle section, Holst has these very, very, very brief periods where he'll speed up the tempo. So the whole tempo is very, very slow. Which honestly, if he's trying to embody the idea of old age, works very well, because obviously we have this music that sounds like it's taking its time. It's taking its time. It's obviously been around, like it's aged enough that, it's just moving at its own pace. It's moving when it wants to move, basically. And he colors that very, very well. But what's interesting about that is in the later sections, specifically like around Roman numeral 3 in the music, is he'll have these slower sections that really grow in terms of dynamics, but they don't really grow in terms of tempo. But then all of a sudden, we have these very brief moments of animato, these very brief moments of very fast-moving passages that eventually just slow down and go back to odd tempo. So it's interesting that he would just randomly include these sporadically, and I think that really kind of gives a sense of push and pull with the idea of age. It really gives a sense of push and pull with development, and really like the sense of like, living in real time, because in life, like, we have those moments of push and pull where things speed up and then they slow back down instantly. So it's interesting to see how he painted that within the music.
Absolutely, it's exactly what you said, and I believe he's very respectful to the idea of someone being old. Now, my little narrative, and just a very subjective reading of the story here, is when someone is old, right? They have lived their life, and as Nick said, they have their wisdom, and they move when they want to move. So that animato is bringing back some of the power that they used to have, and some of the jollity that movement number 4 had, and that's why it's a different color. Like, also the brass instruments are bringing kind of a shiny, a triadic glory topic into old age. So sometimes, and I've heard that from people that are older than me and mature in life in general. Your body is old, but your ideas and your mind actually is very bright, and it's still sparkling. Like, there are some things there, and you can be reminiscent, and you can be like, your mind can be very powerful and strong, and we have that push and pull. The way I would put that into the narrative is brain versus body. The one is very strong and very bright and can still do so many things, but at the same time, we're constantly reminded that the body is weak, and the melody of glory and of splendor is going up with triadic tones, like movements, gestures. At the same time, there is the same ostinato movement, very low register, double bass, strings going down. And that kind of contrast is what creates the push and pull, which is very, very essential to this movement.
Yes, and Nikos, you actually have perfectly set me up for my big topic that I want to talk about, which I mentioned before, is the idea of alienation and what makes this movement of this piece, so different. And I firmly believe that what makes this movement so different is it perfectly encompasses every alienated factor and motif that we previously talked about into one movement. And it makes sense, because if we're talking about the idea of old age and growing through the work, then by re-emphasizing and reusing these alienated motives, like, we're obviously representing the idea of time, going through old experiences, reflecting on old experiences, but obviously to make them sound different, written in this fashion. And I'll give you an example. So at the very end of the piece, we're presented with all these moving chords, block chords, that are all built on fourths and fifths. Now, in the first episode of our podcast, in Mars, the Bringer of War, we talked about how that's a very specific choice to use. Obviously, you see it a lot in music today, but when you just have chords and big sounds built on those open intervals, it really presents a hollow yet powerful sound that are meant to have something in between. So it's interesting to see him reuse this and bring it back to the end of the piece to really create that sense of like hollowness and almost that sense of uncertainty that purposely captures what we were talking about with the idea of old age, that as we grow, we don't know what we're really going to experience, and things can speed up and slow down really at any point. Another example of this that we see is in the middle section, where we have those animato back to a tempo and animato back to a tempo sections. Those are entirely built on rhythmic displacement. So you'll see one passage start moving up and down, and then another passage that echoes that, usually only like a half beat or like a quarter rest after that. And it creates a sense of displacement. So even though we can really pinpoint to hear the sound that's happening, it throws us off by having the sense of displacement, which we saw in the second movement, that, Holst used that sense of displacement to basically say, you can hear the piece, that we will arrive at that piece, but with the displacement, we're not there yet. And when it finally all comes together, then we have achieved peace that we hear in the music. So it's really interesting to me to think about this movement, because I think it personally really shows the idea of aging. It shows the idea of growth over time, and how, we can like live our lives where we are in life, but we have to be able to reflect on things that happened in the past to really show how it all comes together. That's my big takeaway from this movement, at least.
So, in the animato section, as Nick said, there is a major metric displacement. There is also something very interesting. This is the only movement, and this is the only place into the piece that is using bells, like tubular bells, like symphonic bells.
Right.
So, many people that I have read their essays on that are associating the narrative with the bells of death, like that's an ominous like sound, like ding dong, like death is here. Come on, come with me, it's over.
Right.
And it's very ominous, and actually the dee, 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 actually returns into the double basses and the bass trombone and tuba. And so that's kind of an experience that something is changing. Now you've lived your life, you've seen your past glories in front of your eyes, and this is all otherworldly. But this is like really something different, and it's happening. And it's the final battle, the final struggle between life and death. And that's what's really happening there is that after this big struggle, the rest of the movement is, again, something totally different. And, like, I'm talking about the Andante, which my score has marked with a 5. So, something totally different happens. And I'm going to talk about narrative, but would you like to say anything about its unique elements first?
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a thought and I lost it completely. Yeah, actually, it's interesting that you bring up the notion of death. I just remember what I was going to say. How, when we think about the opening of this piece, there's a psychological essay I read a long time ago. How, for the average audience, average music listeners, the things they remember most about a piece of music or a work is the beginning and the end. So, with that in mind, when we think about the beginning of this piece, we're presented with that tritone built chord. And what's interesting about that and about tritones in general is they want to resolve. You want them to resolve. You want that 4 in the tritone to go down to the 3 and then go with your 1 to create that happy sound. But it just doesn't. It just keeps going back and forth in this ostinato. And it's very unsettling to think about that. There's no sense of resolution. So if we think about that with the application of the bells, we're really presented with this sense of like death and the sense of ominousness because we're not arriving at any type of resolution that would suggest any type of happy ending, and which directly connects to what we talked about last episode with the ending of Jollity, with certain orchestras ending with that particular movement. Obviously, if you were to do the whole thing, then you're going to get that sense of like uncertainty and non-resolution. So it's very interesting to think about the use of that and how it applies to those bigger topics.
So, right after that, we've talked about how the triton never really resolves into anything. But it's also there in every kind of little chapter of this piece. So in the last one, we're presented with a harp. We're presented with big notes, like big held tenuti notes for the strings, and then the flutes, the bass flute, and some of for all the other wind instruments come in. But the main motive with the tritone in the double bass is still there. I'm wondering sometimes, is it like the person? Like, so the person has lived their glory in the beginning, and then it goes back and forth into different gestures that are suggesting different things, which is a very otherworldly feature to include in your piece. And then the bells of death start ringing, and there's the ostinato again. Now, the harp and the flute and the woodwinds and this combination usually alludes to angels, heavens, paradise, like afterlife, and the composer is very well aware of that, and we as audience members have kind of the same topic. So it's a kind of a good collection of topics that really serves the evolution of this narrative. And so what happens is that now we're in paradise. That's what I would suggest. And everything is progressing. At the same time, nothing is really changing. There is yet again one more ostinato, so the same device is used multiple times into the piece, but this time it means something completely different. It's not the same ostinato as before, but it's something that is static because, as we said before, there is no specificity in meter the way this is like displaced all the time. There is no specificity in a tonic like environment, like a context, because of the tritone and everything else. So now we're in heaven, and life, like time, doesn't matter anymore. Like in old age, it doesn't matter as much, and then death comes, and that's like the climax of the piece. And now we're in heaven, and the piece ends in a very high heavenly note. And now nothing matters at all ever again. Probably that's my takeaway from like the final moments of that movement.
Absolutely. And I had to ask Nikos, now that we're starting to run a little bit low on time. You mentioned how your biggest takeaway from this piece was the idea of narrativity. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And like, I want to know what you're thinking in terms of like understanding the narrativity throughout the work. Do you think there's narrativity in a specific section? What was your biggest takeaway from that?
I believe that the composer has so many ideas that are unified with specific devices: the tritone, the metric displacement, the ostinati, some orchestration, some very specific and consistent choices in terms of register. But at the same time, he's telling a story that is kind of progressing in time. So we start with the ostinato, we go, the person is there, then we start reliving our past glories. Step motion in ostinato is there, and then we start going to the bells of death or something ominous happening, and then suddenly life is out of our body, and like our spirit is going and it's elevated somewhere, and that place is probably like a heavenly place, like an environment that nothing matters, everything is peaceful, and everything is has come full circle for the person and their soul. That's kind of the narrative that I was thinking about. But again, as you said, and that's wrapping it up, it's all those elements that are like out of this world that make it work, because the composer uses all those elements in a very consistent and very convincing way.
100%. It's interesting to think about it from the idea that, for the first time really in the entirety of the planet, it's like this movement really does go full circle in some type of emotion or some type of feeling. The others, I feel, when you think about their messages, like peace, war, a messenger, or the idea of jollity, they're strictly stapled to that. Whereas this, with old age, like life, like we have all sorts of emotions and all sorts of feelings. So we're really taking on this journey. And it's interesting to see how Holst really put all that together, whether we were experiencing his specific journey at the time or not. It's almost like magical in a way. And we're going to use that as a segue to conclude today's episode, because next episode, in episode 6, we'll be looking at Uranus the Magician, which is another very interesting movement that Nikos and I are going to have quite a lot to talk about. So thank you so much for tuning in. This is Nick Gomez Cologne.
Nikos Myrogiannis, Koukos.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 5 of Out of This World. We will see you very soon with episode 6, and we will talk to you soon. Take care.